Can you see my screen?
There it is.
Yes.
Sweet. All right. Yeah. So tonight we're talking about technical interviews, passing, or I have a lot of experience failing them as well. So hopefully that helps. Who am I? Why should you care? Do some open source work, mostly around the CodeIgniter framework and the PHP Fig. Wrote a couple books on writing secure applications, and then I host a couple podcasts. The PHP Town Hall podcast, co-host with Matt Trask. And then what's relevant for you today? I'm a senior staff engineer at Wayfair, working on development platforms, and we have about, I think the current number is about 3,000 engineers, with about half of those being PHP engineers. And previously, I've been a CTO and senior engineering at various companies. And so I've been on both sides, right? So I've been through the interview process, and then I've also designed various interview processes. So I have a little bit of the idea of what people are looking for on both sides.
Did you say 3,000?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So today we'll cover the technical interview process from phone screen to offer. We will not cover though anything before the phone screen. So like resumes, cover letters, application process, all that, we're mostly not going to cover. Most all of this will be pretty generic. So I know a couple of y'all said you haven't done PHP recently. Mostly it won't use PHP at all. Won't matter. There are a couple examples in PHP. You can probably pretty quickly just see what they would be like in another language. Searching for a job is kind of a scary process. It makes you feel a little defensive. None of us really like the process, I don't think. And so hopefully this can demystify it a little bit, help you be a little better prepared. I came up with the idea for this talk because about 2 years ago, I was on a job search and I hadn't done that in a while. So the last several jobs I'd had had been through referrals. And so if I did any interviewing, it wasn't very, dramatic. Hold on one second. The Zoom screen is covering part of my slides here. All right. Okay. And so I was previously at a smaller startup as a CTO there. I decided what I wanted for my next job was, larger company, larger scale, things like that. And so I ended up interviewing at a lot of bigger tech companies, some like Fang and some, Fang adjacent kind of companies. And really what I found there was just like, wow, this process is way different than like the startup referral process I had been used to. And so most of it follows like a Google style or Elite Code style process. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is. In my opinion, it's not very similar to the work that you do every day. Focuses on signaling for problem solving, focuses on looking for scalable solutions under pressure, but it's not really a one-to-one comparison of what you do most days. And so it's in your best interest to know what the process is and prepare a little bit. So for your next job search, we're going to walk through some examples today, use like a fake search process. And so we're going to talk through like we're going through the process ourselves. This won't be 100% accurate to every company because every company does it slightly different, but this will give you a pretty good example of what it's like. This does pretty closely match what I've seen at like Wayfair is probably a little more humane than this in my experience. It's a little closer to what you do in your job. Matches pretty close to what Facebook did. Might be a little harder than what Google does, but it's a pretty good example. And then we'll focus on examples for up to a senior engineer. And towards the end, we'll talk through kind of the career ladder you get at bigger tech companies. But a senior engineer is kind of the sweet spot for what we're going for here. After that, it changes a lot with different companies. So that's when you're at like the staff engineering level. And so every company has a pretty different process of what they're looking for there. It can be a bit ambiguous. And so we're just going to stop at senior engineer, and then you can kind of infer from there. All right, so the biggest thing I really want to get through to you today is that you just need to prep. Like, it sucks to have to prep just for interviewing and not for actually doing the job, but it's what you have to do, right? There's a lot of hoops to jump through. It's not necessarily exactly what you've been doing, but it's in your best interest to prep for them to get your brain ready to solve problems in this type of manner. It does still use your experience in a lot of ways. it's still the skills you've been developing. You're probably just not used to applying them in this kind of setting. So for myself, for a while, when I first started this process, my general attitude towards it was, oh, I'm not going to prep for interviews. I made it a point not to prep for them. And I just thought, if it's a good fit, it'll naturally fall in place. And I kind of went into every interview that way. I just zero prep. If it's a good fit, it'll work out. And then I was talking to an interviewer at a FANG company, and we were chatting over lunch. And he was saying, he disliked the process as well, but he thinks the process is a way for them to filter people that don't want the job enough to prep for the interview. And then for me, that was just like a light bulb moment. Like, oh no, I've been going about this wrong if that's actually the signal they're trying to get out of this. And it kind of is, right? So for these real big companies, especially the FANGs, they have thousands of applicants, and they have to find some way to filter those applicants down to the people that actually both qualify and want the job enough to work for it. And so that changed my perspective. I decided to put a reasonable amount of effort in prepping for the process. I didn't do anything too wild, right? Because I do want a job that I'm qualified for. Also, time constraints. If you go looking on LeetCode or HackerRank or these websites and forums dedicated to kind of tech job searches, you'll find people that go all out, right? There's people that will take 3 months off work to just practice LeetCode and these type of interviews and get really good at that. I think that's kind of sad that we have an interview process that forces people to do that, and that is a full skill set on its own. But it's something people do, and they probably make a lot of money now because they landed that job. So here's what the funnel is going to look like in most companies. So this will vary a bit from company to company. Startups are probably going to have less structure than big tech. Some big tech might have even more structure. The stages will be something like this. You had their phone screen, your manager screen, a coding test, and then an on-site eval. And that on-site eval, which might actually not be an on-site eval in these days, right? But whether your final eval might be virtual. It's usually broken out into several different steps. So in the past, a lot of times this was like a full day's worth of interviews, or maybe 4 hours of back-to-back interviews with multiple people. Now it's kind of the same thing, but it's virtual, so it might get spread out over a couple of days. But you're usually doing multiple sessions with multiple people, sometimes with panels, things like that. It's pretty intense. So we'll start at step 0. We'll back up a step. This is where either you've applied to a position and now your application is accepted, or maybe a recruiter just reaches out cold, through LinkedIn or something. And so in this case, we're going to say that a recruiter reached out and they know you're interested in a senior software engineer position at Acme Corp, working on their CMS. So now we get to the initial phone screen. This is with the recruiter. And so in this case, it's an internal recruiter. There's different types of recruiters. So the bigger companies will actually have recruiters on staff. There's a couple of different types of those recruiters. Some of them are sourcers, and their job is to go out and find people that they think would be a good fit. They're the people that hit you up on LinkedIn, or, they see that you're involved in a conference and they reach out to you on Twitter, something like that, right? And then also, usually there'll be more high touch recruiters after that. So that sourcer will hand you off to someone. Some companies, it's the same recruiter, the full process. And then also there's external recruiters. And so they're usually partnered up with the company, or they're just kind of cold calling people and pitching them to the company to try to make money. In general, you're going to have a lot better process with an internal recruiter because they know the full process. They're embedded. It's in their best interest to get you the job if you're a good fit. And so the incentives are a little more aligned, and they work closely with the team you'll be working with usually. So you hear from the recruiter. They're going to talk to you about pretty high level things. Why are you looking for a job? What are you looking for? And then if that's going well, they'll usually pitch you on the company, the role, the team towards the end of that. This is probably not going to get very technically in depth at all. There might be a couple kind of softball screener questions just to make sure you do know what you're talking about at all. Mostly, this is probably the least stressful part of the process. This is a good time for you to filter as much as they are, right? You want to see if this role is a good fit for you at all. Also, don't be afraid of saying, well, this role doesn't sound like a good fit, but the company does. And so, let's talk about what other roles you have. Recruiters almost always have several roles open. All right, so how do we prep for this phone screen? You want to have a good story for why you're looking, right? That story shouldn't be, well, I hate my boss, right? You should have a good story for kind of what your career arc has been, what you see the next stage of your career being, how this role might fit into that career progression, things like that. Also think through, what's your what of the next role? What types of problems do you enjoy solving? What types of teams do you like working on? Things like that. So for my own personal prep, I wrote out several things. So the time I was managing, so I wrote out the structures of the teams I had been a part of, the teams that I had managed. I wrote out a few projects that I was proud of and what my role was in those projects. And so this you can get kind of detailed on. There's usually a few types of projects, right? There's projects that you're maybe kind of collaborating on, maybe you do some architecture on, there's projects that you're actually coding on every day. And so break out a few of these and have a couple of examples ready to go of like how you participated at different levels in this. And so a good thing to showcase would be, so I was an individual contributor on this project with 3 other engineers and a manager. We worked through the problem, right? And we shipped, it was successful, everybody's happy. Another example would be I was an individual contributor working on a problem, but this problem spanned 4 different teams. And so have some stories about how you collaborated across teams, how you solved conflicts, different priorities, things like that. Personally, I think it's pretty important to write this stuff down, mostly because I don't have a great memory at all. And so the process of writing it down really helps me keep it fresh in mind. Also, what I would do is I would just have like a list of these things. And so based on the type of interview, I had kind of the menu of things I might want to cover. And then I would just read through it, 30 minutes before the interview. So it's fresh in my mind. Dollars, right? That's kind of why we get jobs, is to get paid. And so most recruiters are not going to be offended if you bring up money. And I like to bring it up pretty early in the conversation. It's bad for the company and it's bad for you if you get like 10 hours into this interview process and then you find out that they don't pay enough money for you to ever consider them. So I bring it up in that initial phone screen with the recruiter. The recruiter will at least know what the range is for total comp. They might not know the details of how they can negotiate that. Helps you gauge if it's worth your time and theirs. If asking about comp disqualifies you for a job, because they want people that aren't motivated by money, they want people that are passionate about the work, blah, blah, blah. I don't think it's a place you want to work. They're not treating you like a professional that should be paid for their time. All right. So you get a call back from the recruiter. They want to schedule a phone call with the hiring manager. So this means we're moving up to the next step. On to the manager screen. So this will be high level, but it will go deeper into the tech usually. Usually the manager will have some type of technical chops, even if they're not, full engineer. Well, they're probably an ex-engineer, right? Even if they're not engineering every day. They'll want to know your experience with specific technologies. And then if it goes well towards the end, they will pitch you on the company and the role. Might not sound like a sales pitch, but it'll be trying to encourage you that this is a role you want. This is a really good spot for you to ask good questions as well, because asking a good question to the manager both tells you, is this someone I would want to work for? You have to work with them every day. And also makes a good impression of you. So people want to be engaged in the process. This is actually a behavioral interview disguised as a conversation. So keep that in mind, right? They're trying to figure out if you're a good fit for this role. All right. How do you prep for the hiring manager phone screen? Think through stories and examples of hard problems that you've solved, projects you're proud of, what your role is in solving that. So it's pretty similar to what we discussed for the last step, but you probably want to get more into depth of what the technical parts of this project were, right? So, we used Kubernetes to deploy our containers and that broke for this reason. And this is how I solved it. Things like that, right? You want to have like pretty specific examples of what issues you hit and how you solved that and what your role was in solving that. If your role in solving that was I don't rewrote Docker from scratch and that solved all your container problems. Maybe not a great example, but it's an example. And then what have you experienced through this, right? What were your good projects? What were your failure projects? What did you learn from both of those? Have at least one example of each. A very typical question you'll get on one of these is, what's the project you're most proud of? And so have an answer pretty much ready for that, but make sure the project showcases some collaboration skills, some hard technical problem solving, and then maybe something innovative or something that scales depending on the role. Also be prepared to discuss the technologies you used on these projects. What was the decision process behind choosing them? What were kind of the trade-offs? Any regrets you have in the choices? How would you have done it differently? Things like that. Like for this step, I prepped a lot with newer technologies that I had used recently. What were the trade-offs that I found in using those? What were the pros and cons of those? All right, so you've aced it. The recruiter reaches back out. They say the hiring manager thinks that you're a good fit, but next up, they want you to do a coding test. So we're on to the third phase. So the coding test is usually either a take-home or it's on an online platform with a live coding test. So the take-home will usually have like a detailed description, what needs to be done, what the scope is, all of that. The live coding test will usually be a smaller problem, and it's probably proctored. So you're probably either with, it could be an engineer through like a company that they contract with, or it could be an engineer actually on the team you're going to work with. In my opinion, it's a much better process if it's an engineer on the team you're going to work on, because it gives you a chance to see like, how do they work well with you to collaborate through a problem? If you make a typo and they're super judgmental about that and they get on you about it and they make you nervous, etc., it might not be a team you want to work on, right? If they take just a typo that seriously. So the coding test is probably a small project, something like where you're designing an architecture, designing an API, or solving an algorithm problem. Most places this will take less than 4 hours to complete, or at least they tell you it should, but most people probably spend a couple more hours in that polishing. Probably a bad sign if you don't polish at all, actually, because it means you didn't really want the job. All right, so an example would be, design an architecture for a web application that does X and does Y and scales to Z users. Here you're going to pay a lot of attention to what the X and the Y are, what the scale you need is. Another example would be designing a RESTful API for processing concert ticket purchases. Or if you're going for kind of the smaller coding example, it might be something like implement bubble sort on X data set and O in time. Then maybe they supply the data set or they tell you where to consume the data set from. The online coding tests are usually smaller problems, usually algorithmic problems, and they want to see how you judge the time and space complexity of your solution. So this will usually be something that takes less than an hour to solve. It'll be on an online platform like Fidelity or HackerRank. Those are both great places for you to check out. These are often proctored, a lot of times with the engineer from the company. You'll see variations of this. You might see something that focus on like object-oriented programming or API concepts or language-specific knowledge. And keep in mind, a lot of these tests will be based in a way that they can judge multiple things at once, right? So they might judge your ability to brute force the algorithm. They might be judging how well you design the code that does that. They might be judging your ability to get to a great time solution there. All right, this is probably the biggest step here if you haven't done these type of interviews before where you need to prep. This is a light version of what the coding and system design interviews will look on the on-site eval. And this will use real-world experience. So the system design and architecture will often be really based on the role you're going for. So it's kind of hard to say exactly what that'll be. For a DevOps role, They'll probably want to make sure you know a lot about servers, pipelines, Kubernetes, something like that. If it's for a web development role, they'll probably want to make sure you know about web servers, databases, APIs, things like that. If it's for something more specific, like a large scale logging infrastructure role, they're going to make sure you know a lot about the details of that, how that works. Most roles these days should probably know the basics of how APIs work. Definitely recommend brushing up on that. Make sure you know how to design a RESTful API from scratch. Make sure you know open API schemas. Make sure it's pretty comfortable for you to think through what an API would be and then document the schema for that API. They're going to test your knowledge of data structures, especially common data structures, and which ones of those are performant to solve the problem you're going for. The ones I've seen most are these here. There are obviously other data structures you could hit. An array and a hash table are probably the most useful data structures you should get started with because you use them in almost every problem. And then for the algorithms themselves, you need to practice common techniques for solving them. You should do some research here and get familiar with this. Basically, the process, you want to learn how to brute force a problem, get to a solution, probably not a performant one, and then iterate on that solution to optimize it. For the algorithms, there's a lot of pattern matching there. So a lot of times you'll see a problem that you've never seen before, but if you break that problem down into what the actual pieces are, those pieces will be things you've actually seen before. Maybe you just described a different way. So some common problems: FizzBuzz, 8 queens, Boggle, subset sum. There's lots of problems out there that you'll see. So you should probably get familiar with, string relation problems, geo problems. How do you think through these general issues in this way? LeetCode's great for this. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the end. It kind of turns into a game where you're practicing solving these problems and you work up through your skill level. Then, like I said, you need to make small improvements. So just get through it, brute force it, and then make iterative improvements. As you go through that, just because you used a certain data structure at first doesn't mean that you need to stick with that data structure. So maybe you do need a bigger refactor at some point. If you are just trying to think this through, maybe try to apply different data structures to the problem and see if one makes this clear to you to give you a solution. It's more important, though, to just 100% brute force the solution than it is to solve 50% of it with the most performant solution. Another thing that's important is while you're going through this with the interviewer, it's really important to talk about what you're doing and how you're thinking about it. It's a bad interview if you just sit there and you're quiet for 30 minutes typing away. You kind of see what's going on, but I have no idea what you're thinking through. Also, if you tell me, I'm thinking about using a hash map to solve this problem, the interviewer might say, oh, okay, well, that would work, but why don't we go ahead and jump to the next solution, maybe using this data structure, right? So they might kind of tee it up for you once you've kind of explained, oh, so I basically know how to brute force this. I just have to type for 10 minutes. Maybe they're not interested in that. And so they'll let you kind of skip that step and go on to the next one. It's important to learn common sorting algorithms. I'd recommend bubble, quick, and merge sort first. It's what I see the most. You'd want to make sure you know when and why you use each one and what the performance characteristics are. And then probably one of the most important ones is just to fill what other knowledge gaps you have. So like when I was going through this, I knew that GraphQL was popular, but it's not something I had ever used personally. And so I spent time to get familiar with it, more what the trade-offs were, what some issues were, poke around, just get a little more familiar with it. And then I made a list of other things like this and worked through those as well. A good way to identify what the gaps are, right? Because we don't always know what our own knowledge gaps are, is just to look around at job listings for jobs you want and then note down the technologies they require. Keep in mind that require list is probably not 100%. You probably don't have to know every single technology listed there to get the job. But if you poke around in a bunch of job listings and you see common patterns, it's probably a good idea to be familiar with those common patterns. And then practice. You have to practice solving algo problems a lot. At least I did. It wasn't comfortable for me, especially under pressure. And so I had to practice a lot to get used to it. Get really comfortable solving them, get comfortable applying the right data structures, determining complexity, things like that. So my practice was mostly LeetCode and HackerRank. Great resources. The quickly solving an algo-based problem under pressure was hardest for me. The other read thinking fast and slow. I consider myself more of the slow thinker. That's where I'm most comfortable. And so I needed a lot more time to kind of build up a cache in my brain of common problems I would see. And that way I could pattern match those problems more quickly. And then I could iteratively solve from there. Once you get for me at least, once I got familiar with this, solving the problems isn't actually all that difficult. It's solving them under a time constraint under pressure that's difficult for me. All right, so we did it. You passed the coding test. You're through all the phone screens, and now we're into the on-site evals. Or maybe not so on-site, right? Maybe it's virtual. So this is a really promising step. It means you've crossed all the entry filters. Now they're ready to really test you, but also now the company's ready to really invest some time into you and maybe some money. If you might be flying on site, they might be paying for your travel and lodging. Also, probably the more expensive part of this is, there's probably gonna be 5 or 6 people spending an hour each with you over the course of a day. And that's a lot of time. So let's say you're going on site, because virtual kind of depends right now. Usually you're going to spend 4 to 6 hours on site. You're probably doing that virtually as well. If you're not local, they're going to fly you in. Usually they'll put you up for one night at a hotel. They'll be pretty flexible on the flights they book because they understand that you have another job most likely that you're trying to work around. So the next steps are filtering for technical ability, plus culture fit, plus whatever else the company cares about, which really depends on the company. Actual interviews vary. Usually you'll have like 1 or 2 coding tests, with 1 or 2 behavioral interviews, and then you'll have probably at least 1 system design interview. So we're going in for this. Let's say we're going to arrive Thursday night. The interview starts at 9 a.m. on Friday. So you're flying into Acme Corp. Some just general advice, you do you, but I would say get to bed early. Make sure you get a good night's sleep. Take it easy on the food and booze or anything like that. Make sure you wake up early. I like to wake up several hours before the interview because I like my coffee and it takes me a couple hours to really feel like all the gears are turning. And so I just have to adjust my schedule for that and make sure I get up plenty early, have plenty of coffee, not too much, and just feel really awake and ready. I also like to get a really well-rounded breakfast. I'm going to be using my brain a lot. And so I want to make sure I have enough fuel to get through the day. Also, especially if you're traveling somewhere you're not used to, make sure you plan to get there pretty early. You don't want to be stressed from getting lost or from traffic or anything like that. Most companies that won't disqualify you if you're late, but you're going to be really stressed if you are. And so you don't want that. So here's the schedule that you have through Acme Corp. There's 10 minutes at the end of each interview set aside for you to ask questions back to the people interviewing you. And well-organized recruiters will give you the schedule and the names of the interviewers beforehand. I usually like to look up the interviewer's LinkedIn, maybe prep some questions to ask them based on what I see their experience are. That's a good segue into that last 10-minute Q&A you have with them. So if you can really speak to their experience, listen, ask them questions, actually be curious about what their experience is. That gives a great impression. Also, these people you're going to be working with, hopefully, very closely, probably for years. And so it's good for you to go ahead and know something about them when you come into the job. All right, so we're parachuting into this. This is going to be a long day, right? So be prepared for that. It's rough. So we're going to arrive about 9. You're going to meet with the recruiter. So this is not really an interview. It's pretty casual. They're going to make sure you're comfortable, show you to the interview room, things like that. Usually you'll stay in that same room all day. Sometimes you bounce around, but most companies you're going to just stay there. And the recruiter then is going to walk you through what to expect and where to go. Next up, you're going to have a behavioral interview with the hiring manager. So expect just a more in-depth version of the phone screen. The same stories you prep will probably be fine. This is why you want to have multiple stories, though. You can't just say, telling the same exact story from what you told him before. You have to be able to bounce around. It's a conversation, right? You're not just getting up on stage. One thing you might see is where they give you scenarios and ask you how you'd solve them. So it might be like, okay, so tell me, let's say you and the project manager disagree on the value of technical debt to a project. Project manager wants you to just ship features, but you see this technical debt that's a big problem for the team and it's slowing you down. If y'all could just fix it, it would increase your velocity for the next 6 months. How would you convince that PM to let you work on that technical debt? Right? They might throw out a scenario like that, and then you have to respond with what you would do. Make sure to ask them questions about this. This is another great time for you to screen the team and the role as well. Keep in mind throughout the interview process, this isn't one way. This isn't them just deciding if they want to hire you. This is you deciding if you want to work with them. Meeting your hiring manager affects it a lot. I've read studies that like your hiring manager and your commute to work are some of the 2 most important factors to your happiness. So make sure you're going into this kind of critically. Make sure to ask for expectations. What does success look like in the role? What do they expect from you in your first 90 days? What's their working style? What time do they start work? Things like that. If they expect you to work from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day, now's a good time to kind of fill that out. It might be a problem. All right, this next step is probably the most intense part of this. You're gonna have 1 or 2 coding interviews. They hopefully are mixed up so they're not back to back, so you have some little time to compose yourself. This is usually on a whiteboard, not always. It's kind of another trick. If it's in person, it's a good chance it will be on the whiteboard. You could ask the recruiter this before you go. And so if it is, you want to at least be a little familiar with solving problems on a whiteboard, because it's not nearly the same as typing. A lot of people, when they prep for interviews, will actually buy a whiteboard, put it in their office, and use that as a part of their prep for interviews, just to get used to writing on the whiteboard. When you're going through this process, they'll usually give you like a first thing to solve, and then once you solve it, they'll give you the next thing to solve, and it's going to grow with iterations after you solve each one. So don't be thrown off by that. Usually they'll have a couple set up so that they can keep growing. And then either you run out of time or you run out of problems. It's not always a bad thing to run out of problems. It just depends on how the interview is going. Do expect that after the end of each iteration, they're going to ask you what the time and space complexity are for what you just did. Be prepared to answer that. Usually this will be kind of the basics, and then you're going to iterate through, and it's going to become a harder problem as you go. They're going to keep making it more difficult. And so either, like I said, they're going to run out of time, or they're going to find the edge of your knowledge. And that's an okay thing. It doesn't feel good to be like, oh, I don't know how to do that. I don't see an answer to this. I don't see a solution. But that can also be fine, because for a lot of interviews, you prep progressively harder and harder ones to determine how to level someone in your career ladder, or just to find out where the edges, the gaps in their knowledge are. And that's just data as input. It's not necessarily a denial. So I want to throw an example just so you see what I'm talking about when I talk about these problems. So this is something where pattern matching comes in. So you have 2 problems described here, right? Given an array of 100 most common child names in 2021, sort them alphabetically. Or another problem, list the top 10 products sold alphabetically on the sidebar of the website. Given an array of the top 1,000 products where the keys to their popularity and the value is the product name, return an array. So you can actually use quicksort to solve both of these problems. So the child names, you would just do one quicksort on the values. That's all you do, because you're sorting alphabetically. In PHP, it would look something like this. You just have your child names as an array. You sort that array and then return the child names. For the next one, it's a little more complicated. You're going to sort on popularity first. You're going to filter that to the top 10, and then you're going to sort alphabetically after that. So here we have our products as an array. We're going to do a key-based reverse sort on the products. Then we're going to slice those to the top 10. Then we're going to sort alphabetically, and then we're going to return the products. So there's a caveat here, right? Like, this is a pretty simple solution, A lot of the reason it's simple is because we're able to use quicksort, which PHP has built in to their search function. You're probably not going to get that in an actual interview. They're probably going to want you to write the sort algorithm yourself. And they'll also want you to know how fast that is. In this case, it's cool. You know, the C version is going to be a lot faster than what you'll do in user-oriented PHP. But you should be prepared to write those sort functions because they'll probably expect you to. They'll also probably throw out a curveball, right? So like if you're in a language like JavaScript, right, and quicksort supported, they're probably going to throw out a problem where, you know, maybe merge sort is the most performant solution. All right, so on to the next interview, the system design. This is, in this case, with a senior architect. It could be with anyone, probably senior engineer and up. Be ready to discuss how you're thinking about designing a system, what the scaling concerns are, what the trade-offs are. One of the biggest tips I have here is just to ask scoping questions early. Gather a bunch of requirements, ask them the scaling, expectations, you know, memory and space concerns. And then if you're on the whiteboard, I like to write all that down for reference later. And then if there's any math to do, right, like we need to store 100 bytes per user, and we're going to have 100,000 users in the first year, but that's going to grow to 1 million users over 5 years, things like that. I like to go ahead and do all that math right there on the whiteboard. That way I can reference it later. You're going to be nervous, and so it's really helpful to keep that top of mind in case you start working on, you know, your actual design, and then you need to wipe something away, and oh, now I forgot what I need to scale to. This is just an example, basic example of what a system design might look like. This is probably the kind of thing you're going to end up drawing on the whiteboard, where you design, you know, how the users come in, how they're balanced to different web servers, what the data stores look like, and then any worker processes hitting those data stores. One thing a lot of companies throw in is lunch with an engineer on the team. This is pretty cool. It helps you get a good idea of what your prospective team is going to look like. It's a really good chance for you to ask honest questions about the team, the company, the role, things like that. Usually the interviewer is not grading you. They're maybe not even in the actual interview loop. They can probably still veto you though, if you know, you do something egregious. Be nice, but be yourself and use this really as a good chance for you to get to know what the company's like with less pressure. And then you have the debrief with the recruiter. It's time to decompress, you know, it's over. Make sure to ask the recruiter about next steps and about timing. If it's going to take the company 2 weeks to get back to you, you don't want to be thinking it's the next day. You want to always know it's going to be 2 weeks so that you don't have to wait too long. It depends on the company, how long you have to wait. Kind of the bigger the company, the longer the wait is usually. Right now, you're usually looking about a week or two. You know, in a hotter market like we're in right now, maybe closer to the week, maybe less. In a less hot market for engineers, it might be longer, mostly because it's hard for companies to make these decisions quickly. So if they're not motivated to, because people are not taking offers because they're getting other ones faster. If they're not motivated to, they're probably not going to. All right, so you hear back from the recruiter and they give you an offer. So the offer starts the negotiation process. This will depend on your level, your position in the market, and how large the company is. Having multiple offers on the table is really just the key to negotiating. That tells you what you're worth in the market. So if you got 3 offers on the table, you have a pretty good idea of what you can expect. Also, never be afraid to tell your recruiter that you have other offers on the table. Don't tell them the amounts. Maybe tell them the companies, especially if it's a bigger company. But it's okay to let them know. It actually helps the process a lot for them to know because they get a lot more incentivized to hire you. It's kind of weird how that is. Or it struck me as weird, but it actually like streamlines the process a ton, just having another offer on the table. So for negotiation, the first offer they give you is almost never their final offer. No decent company is going to rescind an offer because you asked for more within reason. If they do, it's probably not a company you want to work with. This is business. It's not personal. Try not to get emotional. It can feel a little emotional, right? Because this is either, like how am I going to pay the bills kind of thing, where it's like, oh, this is a lot of money. This is very important to me kind of thing. Try to keep in mind, this is a company. They're not family. They're pricing you in a market and they're hiring engineers out of that market. This is another place where having multiple offers really helps you see that perspective. One big thing is don't undervalue yourself. I see more engineers undervalue themselves than overvalue themselves. It's really a job seekers market for engineers right now. So one example I want to show you. So here are some of the engineering levels at Google. And so it's important for you to know, where did they level you? Because sometimes you'll get down leveled, sometimes you'll get up leveled, almost always down leveled though, right? So if you're, say, a senior engineer at your company, you might get down leveled to a software engineer 2 at Google. That's pretty normal. I wouldn't take that as like an offense. Google software engineer 2 probably pays more than your company's senior engineer anyway. So that's worth keeping in mind. It is really important to know what these levels are so you can compare how you're being leveled and what the comp structures are. Levels.fyi is a great resource for this. So you can put in the company and then you can see what the levels are, how the levels compare across companies, and how the comp compares for those levels. The data is not 100% accurate because it's user submitted, but it's pretty helpful. It's important to know too that total comp is salary plus equity plus benefits. A lot of companies will have kind of the lower salary equation and then a much higher equity and benefit equation. And that's okay for the most part. There's kind of a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths from startups, where startups might promise you a ton of equity and give you a lot of percentage, but that never comes through. And the company closes a year later, and now you just made below market pay for no reason, right? As the companies get bigger, that's less of a concern, especially if they're publicly traded. If they're publicly traded, you're probably going to get RSUs that you can vest and sell quarterly. So it is pretty close to liquid comp. Also, as you're going through this process, note that some companies just can't budge on salary. A lot of companies will set a salary ceiling. So like maybe the top VPs only make 200 grand a year there. And so you're not going to get more than 200 grand a year in salary. They can probably budge on other parts though. They can probably budge on equity or benefits. Non-salary compensation can make up a surprising amount of total comp. I think it's important for us to share more of this in the industry so we know what's out there. It's not abnormal for a senior engineer at a thing, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. It's not abnormal for them to pay 150K in salary, 150K in RSUs, and 100K stock signing bonus. As you go through this process, do talk about vesting schedules. It's something you may be able to negotiate on. You might want to research this for the company you're interviewing for. So the vesting schedule, just to give you a general idea, what you'll usually see is, let's say you're getting RSUs and you're getting 150 grand a year in RSUs. Those are reserved stock units. You'll probably have a 1-year cliff. And so that cliff means that you can't sell, you actually don't get them. You can't vest them for a year of being there. That's to make sure that you work out at the company. After a year, you'll vest, and then you can sell those if you want. And then every quarter after that, or maybe every 6 months after that, you'll get another vest, which is a percentage of that 150, right? So if you're getting 150 a year and you vest, quarterly, you're getting a fourth of that 150 every quarter to vest. Some companies you can negotiate you can't usually negotiate the full vesting schedule, but you can probably negotiate the cliff. So it's worth knowing. Get paid. There's no reason to be undervalued. So a few parting thoughts. Practice. Get a whiteboard, like we talked about. Make sure you're doing hours of LeetCode. It might feel dumb, but actually it gets kind of enjoyable. It's problem solving. It's like a puzzle. Make yourself solve for time and space complexity. I don't remember if LeetCode does it. Some of them will not require that, and some of them do. I recommend making yourself solve for it. Another cool thing to do is just ask friends and peers to give you mock interviews. It can be pretty easy to just breeze through this stuff when you're by yourself looking at your computer screen. Once someone else is talking to you and watching you do this, it can get pretty nerve-wracking and scary, and that can make it a lot harder. So if you can kind of get some fake pressure there from friends and peers, it'll make the actual pressure easier to deal with. And then interview with multiple companies. I don't know if I've ever actually only interviewed for one company at a time. I guess it's kind of the cheat code. Interview for multiple. Probably the more interviews you get through, the easier the process gets because you're more comfortable with it. And so if you do 5 interviews, by the last couple, it's probably going to be a lot less stressful. And then if you get multiple offers, like we talked about, that puts you in a much stronger position. And then examples. Really take some time to think through examples, to write out stories. Humans deal in stories. We don't deal just in tech. It's really hard to explain straight up technical problems too for someone that doesn't have the context you have. So that's a part of the storytelling that you have to get good at. How do you explain the technical context you need to understand why your solution to that problem was important? I had stories and examples for successful, failed projects, difficult people I worked with, times I'd been convinced that someone else was right, or times that I'd convinced someone else that I was right, getting consensus across multiple teams, and then lots of stories about various technologies for different projects and the trade-offs there. So this tweet was by the creator of Homebrew, who, if you use Mac, you probably use, about how he felt in an interview at Google. He's a great engineer, but this didn't show through in his interview. So be prepared to showcase your engineering abilities via the interview. I know it takes a little work, it takes some prep, but it's worth it. Here's some resources you check out. Cracking the Coding Interview is it's a book. It's probably the best resource really for prepping for coding interviews, and it's pretty just ubiquitous across the industry. A lot of companies will just straight up steal problems from this book and use them in their hiring process. It's worth reading, pretty detailed. Educated.io has some great interactive courses. I especially enjoy their system design course. The cool thing about it is it'll kind of take a company. It'll be like, oh, how would you design the homepage on Facebook? And then it'll just tell you how they did it. And that's pretty interesting, actually. Even if you already kind of know how to solve system design problems in general and scale them, it's interesting to see different ways that you might solve it for actual, website you use. And then LeetCode, I mentioned it a ton. Get on there. It's probably the best resource for, getting really comfortable with solving coding tests. And then Randall Canna has an ultimate list of job hunting resources for developers. It's kind of just a one-stop shop with a ton of information about the job hunting process. And then lastly, levels.fyi. It's that site where you can punch different companies and see how the roles compare and what the comp is. All right, if you want to go through an interview process, ours isn't quite as bad as the one I laid out here. I hope you'll enjoy it. We try to make sure you feel like a person through the process and not a robot. We have a couple take-home options, and we try to make sure that we can work with you in the way that you work best. Some people do best with kind of the whiteboard live coding thing. Some people do best with a take-home problem that they can really take their time on. And so we try to give you both options so that you can solve that in the way that you feel most comfortable with. Reach out if you're interested. And thank you. Ben Edmunds on Twitter and ben.edmunds@gmail if you want to reach out.
Hey, thanks, Ben, for presenting tonight. Do you want to take any questions? Is that cool?
Sure. Do it.
If you have a question, speak up.
I'm trying to figure out how to get back to the Zoom screen so I can get my screen back here.
Hi, Ben. This is Samir. It was a very good talk. I really enjoyed it. I had a question regarding the completeness of the code. As you said, I mean, it's a time pressure. I get it. But I think, do they give like a different view if you can run the code and everything passes, the tests pass, or how much they weigh against it? I mean, so.
It just depends on the setup, really, and kind of the problem. So, example, when I first interviewed at Wayfair, they gave me a problem. So they gave me the problem, and they also gave me a test suite. And so I could kind of run the problem against the test suite. In that case, they're probably expecting you to pass the full test suite because they already gave you one. If it's an algorithm problem, where they're saying like the quick sort example I gave, they're probably not expecting the test suite there. They're probably expecting you to at least be able to brute force it and tell you them what the time and space complexity are, and then probably one other more performant iteration on top of that and tell them what the time complexity on that is. And then if you can do more, it probably helps you level up in their system, but it's probably not an expectation. So usually you want about 2 iterations.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. And also, like, it's worth calling out, right? This is my experience. This is what I've seen. It's constantly changing. Like even at Wayfair, we're like constantly A/B testing different interview processes. Things get harder if we don't need to hire as much. Things might not necessarily get easier, but we'll get a little more flexible with how we work with you if we need to hire more.
So if you interview for a company and it doesn't work out with that specific team, maybe you a little green on the interviews, like are you blacklisted from the company, or do you get multiple shots like over time?
Most companies will give you about a year, like a year breathing period, and then you can re-interview. Depends on the company though. Some you can kind of re-interview for a different role right away. Also, one thing we do a lot at Wayfair is, I don't think this engineer was a great fit for this team for this reason, but I do think they'd be a great fit for this team. And so we'll suggest that the recruiter put them in the interview loop for a different role.
Yeah, I'd say you pretty much just have to ask, because unless they really wanted you to be on another team, they're not going to say anything unless you ask.
Yeah, I also throw out too, like, people fail these constantly and then end up still coming to the companies later. So don't take it as try not to take it as you're not good enough to work there kind of thing. Take it as either you weren't a great fit for that role. Maybe you were off that day. Maybe your interviewer was off that day, or you just didn't prep enough. Rarely is it that you're actually just, not great enough to work at that company, because you could be right with the right prep.
So Ben, another question I had is, I gave actually here 2 interviews to tech companies, and is it like a code there that they don't give you the feedback? They just say in one-liner, they just send email that we are not going to go with you, and that's it. And even if my tries to like get some feedback, there's no possible of getting it. So how do we know in the interview itself that how did I did, or what did I go wrong? Any thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
I hate it. Most companies won't give you any feedback, and it's horrible. There's kind of like legal risk reasons for that. If they were to tell you you're getting picked for, some kind of culture fit thing, that might, it could be like a lawsuit or something. So there's a lot of just kind of risk avoidance there. Had a couple companies tell me the reason that it wasn't a pick. Usually that reason is when either something in the company changes and they move the role, or they just decide it wasn't a good fit for something outside of your control. They don't usually tell you if you failed the interview for a certain reason, which is really frustrating. And I guess the best thing to do there is just interview more. As you do a few, you can kind of like start to fill out where you did poorly.
Okay.
Again, you can always ask, but I wouldn't expect a substantial answer. Sometimes you might get one, sometimes usually you won't.
Yeah.
I have a more of a comment, but might spark some discussion. Aside from like the big companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook and stuff, there was a company I was interviewing for once that wanted me to do a technical challenge thing, or code challenge, whatever. And their request seemed pretty unreasonable. It was basically like 8 to 12 hours of work is what they said, and stuff like that. And I ended up just saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And they basically let me skip it at that point. So I don't know. They're like, and it helps that I have a lot of open source work. I publish stuff on GitHub. I have stuff to share. So it's just like when, I don't know, it's one of those things I've just felt like it was completely unreasonable. I was like, no, I'm not going to take that. And they wanted to continue anyways. Is that, I don't know, is that a common thing you see, or anybody else seen anything like that before? It's just a weird situation I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, back when I like designed interview process at the startup, it was I had basically a general rule. If you had enough GitHub code that I didn't need any more signal that you knew how to code, then I wouldn't give you a coding test, because why would I, right? Like, I really don't care that you can solve an algorithm in 30 minutes. I care that you can code, and you probably have better code on GitHub. A lot of other companies just have like a standard process though. So I don't think I've ever had one let me skip, but I have turned them down before. I actually turned down Amazon when they like told me what their whole process was. I'm like, no, I just can't. I don't care.
I went through that one.
Read
It's rough.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, I was going to say that just to add to that, what I've seen is for, I think, the product management interviews, not necessarily the technical, they give you a take home thing, and which might be quite involved, and you have to present it back. And there will be a full question and answer session on that one. That might actually take a lot of time figuring that out and getting them back to them.
So I guess one thing I have seen is if you tell them like, I just don't have time to do that, they might give you another option of like live coding for a couple hours or something like that. I have seen that at a couple places.
Smaller companies, there's a lot of flexibility, but the bigger company you get, the less flexibility there'll be. So maybe if they have a second option, like you can switch to live coding, but you have to fill the whole process because they're going to have a lot of people interviewing for the position and need to be able to compare people. But
That makes sense.
Small 40-person company, they might not really have thought that much about their process. So if you push back, then you can probably, get a different situation. So, but yeah, I mean, Microsoft or Google, you're going to have to follow their process if you want to work there. So it's just kind of do it or don't work there.
So interesting on the flip side is I brought it up before, is like maybe we should introduce a coding aspect to our interview process, but internally I've gotten a pushback from other leads engineers saying it's a waste of time, which is interesting to me. I mean, I see the pros of it, but I also see the cons of it at the same time. It's a waste of time on both sides potentially. It could take a problem, could only take a couple hours, but it could also take 10, 12 hours, and no one wants to waste their time with that. And then reviewing it, of course.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is the companies that do publish studies about these interview processes, they're hardly better than random on gauging success at scale. So, it is what it is. It's hard to hire thousands of people well. So you're going to have a process and stick with it. I mean, personally at PageWeave, we've done better with people who have open source contributions, and you can actually see large amounts of code. It's much less risky to hire them, but that doesn't really work when you need to hire 10,000 engineers.
Yeah, I've only done a few coding interviews all across my jobs, and none of them seemed particularly relevant to the work I ended up actually doing, which is the big problem that I've seen with them anyways. And then there's been one, there was one where we did like a little more of a pairing. I wouldn't call it a code. I wouldn't call it like pair programming fully, and I wouldn't call it quite a challenge, but it was somewhere in the middle, and that was actually kind of useful.
Yeah, one of my favorite interviews, actually, the thing about all of them was like they gave me a PR with a lot of problems and said like, hey, review this PR. And that felt like we were gonna have discussions about how, nitpicky to get with it. I was able to really go through it, and it was still very technical, but it didn't feel pressured, right? I guess unless Jeremy writes your PR, because that would have been pressure.
Has anyone been paid like for a trial day or project as part of their interview? Well, the reason I ask is
Yeah.
because like if you're doing work that's productive for the company for free, is supposedly like a legal problem.
Yeah, I don't know how much of that work would be productive, right? Especially if you're having the candidates do the same work over and over.
Yeah, I mean, in our interview process, we do something similar to that bad PR of we show somebody code, have them walk us through it, and talk about how they would improve it. Which, I don't know, seems a lot less stressful than giving you some time test. But there is no magic bullet on interviewing people. And so everybody has different processes because they're always trying to find something better, and you can always improve any process. So
for the PR, do you give it to them to take home and they do it for a day and then you come back and discuss it? Or is the first time they see it when you want them to walk you through it?
yeah, I mean, we do ours live because we try to limit the amount of time we're spending and the candidate's spending. We've tried longer processes, and it literally, we learn no more on spending 2 or 3 hours in the interview process as we did when we spent 10. Now, possibly that's because we didn't have a good enough design, but I think especially for a small company, if you can't spend a bunch of time designing a great process, spending more time doing the same thing does not improve outcomes. So, at Wayfair, right, you're bringing in a lot more people, you have a lot more testing on your design process. But if you're a small company, it's the same 5 people doing all the interviews. Like, having them spend extra time on them is not super helpful. So you got to kind of create an interview process that works with your team. And that's the other thing you think too, right? If you're going to ask somebody to do a coding challenge where they spend 8 hours on it and they're producing 500 lines of code, right? Are you going to spend the time it takes to really gain knowledge from reviewing that? So if you're not, then well, you obviously don't want to ask that question. You're just wasting their time and your time. So you have to find quicker replacements. Now, if you are going to spend an hour reviewing that, maybe a follow-up session with the candidate where you talk about the code they wrote, then it's probably super valuable. But I mean, interviewing is hard, right? It's all trade-offs. How much time do we spend to bring in somebody new to the team versus the trade-offs of getting a bad candidate?
Yeah, that's one thing too. I try to think about designing interview processes. Like with a startup, it's pretty quick and easy to fire someone, and so a bad candidate isn't really going to drag your team a lot. But at bigger companies, and I worked for the government once, it took 6 months to fire someone. And so in that case, you probably want to filter a little more upfront because a bad candidate has a longer knock-on effect.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this too, was that at a FANG, you're just going to have more applicants. So you need more screening steps.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a harder interview process. And so if you want one of those positions, you really have to be committed to it. Otherwise, don't waste your own time and look at smaller companies that are going to have a simpler interview process. I do feel like maybe they're not as crazy as they used to be. Last time I was interviewed at FANG Adjacent with LinkedIn, I don't know, 15 years ago, and I felt like I had 2 days of in-persons with them as part of that interview process. So maybe it's been dialed back some since that period.
I think take-homes are just the biggest thing. Hopefully Corona fix, because I used to hate whiteboarding so much. It's not something we ever did. When's the last time you guys whiteboarded code? Maybe design, but not code. So hopefully COVID fixes that and we get take-homes more often. It's always like those better.
Yeah, I mean, I would say those whiteboard ones are super stressful too. Especially if they're 4 people in the room with you whiteboarding. Those are rough to keep your composure when you get stuck. You just forget Yeah, I mean, I've studied this algorithm or I've used it a ton of times, but it's gone. It's not in the brain. It's really rough to get back on track.
Anyone have anything else? All right. Thanks again, Ben. I'm gonna stop recording.